Hi, my name is Natalie Maguire. I am a junior at Georgia Gwinnett College, and today I'm going to be talking about cancer incidence amongst firefighters. Firefighters are a big part of our society as they are constantly battling fires, but with this comes an alternative risk, and that is many firefighters will have a future battle not just against the flames, but against cancer. According to Wolf et al., over 4% of surveyed firefighters received a cancer diagnosis at some point in their life, with the age-specific cancer rate up to 323% times higher than that of the general population. Not only that, but those that served 15 years or more in the department were 1.7 times more likely to develop cancer than those that had served less than 15 years. The purpose of this study was to first see if firefighters were at an increased risk of developing cancer, and if so, what are the factors that are associated with this increased risk, any correlations, what is playing into this increased risk of developing cancer. And finally, what are some ways that we can prevent cancer in the future for this population? Preventative measures, interventions, all that kind of thing. This study took on a survey design. The survey was sent out to 10,649 firefighters. The survey contained 64 questions. These questions were broken down into 5 different topics. The first being demographics, second PPE, or personal protective equipment, third contamination. They also looked at attitudes, awareness, and training, and lastly they looked at the overall health of a firefighter. The sample size was about 24% of the UK's total firefighter workforce. So again, if we look at that, the sample size being 10,649 firefighters, from there, 441, or 4% of these firefighters, had received a cancer diagnosis at some point in their life. 373 of them would provide further details on this cancer diagnosis. After that, those 373 firefighters were asked how long they were a part of the fire and rescue service before they had received a cancer diagnosis. 17 of the firefighters said that their cancer diagnosis came before joining the workforce. 49 of the firefighters wished to not answer the question, in which both of those groups were released from the study and excluded from further analysis. On the other hand, 307 of the firefighters continued through the study. The odds ratios with a 95% confidence interval were used to assess the statistical significance of differences between more or less exposed groups. The analyses were conducted using Statistical Package for Social Sciences, or SPSS, and the Stats Models module for Python. The odds ratios were also adjusted for age, as they were the only independent variable found to have a significant positive relationship with cancer incidence. Overall, the study found that 3% of the surveyed firefighters had received a cancer diagnosis after joining the fire and rescue service, or 307 from our sample size. The model age of diagnosis was from age 45 to 49, which accounted for about 28% of the surveyed firefighters. Within the study, we found that 28 different cancers were recorded within these firefighters that had cancer, and skin cancer was the most prevalent, with 36% of the firefighters having this type. When the study looked at demographics, the proportion of firefighters with a cancer diagnosis increased with age, seniority of role, and length of service. All of those factors you can see in the graph over to the right, with age increasing proportion, the seniority of role, you can see the principal manager having the biggest proportion, and also the length of service increasing as well. The study also found that firefighters that served 15 years or more were 1.7 times more likely to develop cancer. The study also looked at the health and lifestyle of certain firefighters. First, they looked at medical screening and what percentage of firefighters had access to that. So 69 had access to regular 3-yearly medical screening, 13% had access to an annual medical screening, and breathing apparatus or BA instructors were provided a 6-monthly medical screening. Out of the surveyed firefighters, 14% had received a type of cancer screening. This could have been routine and or diagnostic. They also looked at lifestyle factors linked to chronic health conditions, such as exercise habits, how often and how long you exercised, how much alcohol you consumed, what were your sunbathing habits, and how often did you smoke. When we compared the two groups of those that had a lot of exercise versus those that had a lot of alcohol versus a little alcohol, bad sunbathing habits versus healthy sunbathing habits, and those that smoked a lot versus those that didn't smoke, there was really no statistical difference between the two groups. The occupational exposure to toxins were also looked at. There were not many statistical differences between two certain groups. The first being that firefighters that often attended incidents without their PPE versus those that never attended incidents without their PPE. Both of those were pretty similar. Also, those that sometimes wore their PPE versus those that never attended incidents without their PPE didn't have a significant difference there. An interesting find, though, would be that there was a statistically significantly larger proportion of firefighters that preferred not to say if they attended incidents without their PPE versus those that always wore their PPE. The study went on to suggest that maybe those that preferred not to say were embarrassed about their PPE habits, or they did not want to admit to not wearing their PPE within these accidents. Those that preferred not to say were twice as likely to have a cancer diagnosis, though. A little disclaimer here is that personal protective equipment included a wide range of equipment, and that could significantly change the results and the differences, because PPE could range from being a very high-tech PPE versus one that is just a mask that's going to block larger particles. So there's a big difference, a wide range, a wide gap, and may not accurately reflect those statistical differences. When we look at personal contamination, this is something that the study focused a lot on as one of the main factors that could contribute to an increase in cancer diagnoses. The personal contamination were significantly associated with an increased odds ratio of developing cancer. I highlighted 3 main groups from this graph. One of those was eating while wearing PPE. You can see in that yellow highlighted that you have an increased odds ratio, the odds ratio being 1.8. Not only that, but noticing soot in their nose or throat after fires was associated with an average odds ratio of 2. So you can see after an incident up to a day after washing, increased odds ratio, after incident until washing, increased odds ratio, and the really big jump here would be over 1 day after an incident is a pretty large odds ratio. Lastly, if you look at the highlighted red, you can see that remaining in your personal protective equipment more than 4 hours led to an average odds ratio of 2.3. It starts just from 30 minutes to an hour, increasing the odds ratio. 1 to 2 hours, an increase. 2 to 3 hours, a more significant increase in the odds ratio. Then we have this weird drop off from 3 to 4 hours, which is below 1 for an odds ratio. Very strange. But then we jump up to over 4 hours and you have this significant increase in the odds ratio. So definitely something to look at there. When we look at cross-contamination and cleaning methods, cross-contamination is when a clean and non-contaminated personal protective equipment or their clothing or something of the sort is touching or comes into direct or indirect contact with a contaminated and dirty product. So this could be poorly controlled cleaning procedures. That is one way that we can have cross-contamination, For example, using a washing machine for both the contaminated and non-contaminated personal protective equipment. There's also a significant increase in the odds ratio when the firefighters failed to separate their clean and dirty PPE, as well as failing to designate separate clean and dirty zones or spaces. Both of those led to an increase in the cancer odds ratio. Not only that, but storing fire gloves with other PPE was associated with an increased odds ratio. Two very interesting facts here that the data found was that 71% of the surveyed firefighters never even set in their gloves for professional cleaning. Not only that, but 20% of the firefighters said they never got their fire gloves cleaned at all. So again, just from the last slide, bringing up the graphs. In the top box, you can see the increase in the odds ratio when using a washing machine to clean the PPE for both clean and dirty. So fire gloves increased, fire hood increased odds ratio, and then the tunic or trousers increased odds ratio. In the second box, you can see the storage of the personal protective equipment, increased odds ratio with clean and dirty PPE not being separated, and fire gloves stored with other items of personal protective equipment. Something that I didn't mention in the previous slide was personal protective equipment being transported home for cleaning, so doing their laundry at home. This is another source of cross-contamination, which not only is dangerous for the firefighters, but also for those that live with the firefighters, family, children, parents, spouses, anything of the sorts. So another dangerous situation to be in. The study concluded that firefighters are ultimately at an increased risk of receiving a cancer diagnosis compared to that of the general population. One of the reasons that this might be, one correlation that the data found, was that failing to adhere to protocol or implementing standards regarding the contaminated PPE led to a significant increase in the likelihood of developing cancer. The study went on to suggest that interventions such as policies or guidelines, these kind of rules that reduce cross-contamination and to target the personal contamination, such as eating while wearing your personal protective equipment, all of that should be looked at to sort of reduce the cancer incidence rate. The study was overall very detailed, very good. It looked at a lot of factors, but one thing it did not look at were minority groups, such as the female population or particular ethnic groups. When looking at these two smaller groups, it was hard to rely on the data just because the data was so skewed, the results were skewed, it wasn't very reliable. You could definitely see this in the graph for the crude age-specific rate of cancer diagnosis. That was a major example, just because there are so little firefighter in the female population, or females in the firefighter population. It definitely is harder to get a bigger sample size. So that is definitely one of the criticisms I have for that. Secondly, the demographics were not surveyed as closely as I would have liked, just because that is a factor that can play into future health problems, such as cancer. So things like past health issues and family history. And looking at that is definitely something that could greatly influence the increased likelihood of developing cancer. And that study did not really take that into account. With all that being said, the study did have a lot of strengths. The study adjusted for certain factors like age, which was super helpful. It made the data more reliable, more accurate. It also took time to look at the interventions that could reduce the likelihood of developing cancer. It wasn't as detailed as I would have liked it, but it definitely provides a basis for more research to be had. The study also sorted out the participants that would mess with the results in the very beginning. So we sorted out those that had received a cancer diagnosis prior to joining the fire and rescue service, as well as those that would not provide further details. It also gave a lot of graphs and data to support all their claims, very much looking at the odds ratios and percentages and that kind of thing, which was very helpful. Overall, I would say the study was very detailed, very good, and there is an increased likelihood of cancer in firefighters, and I do think that is something that we need to look at more closely.